The morning Arabella Davenport arrived at Vanderbilt House, it was raining, not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that poets write about. This was the cold, indifferent rain of a Connecticut November, the kind that soaks through wool coats and reminds you, without apology, that the world does not adjust itself to your circumstances. She arrived in a hired carriage, not her family's. The Davenport carriages had been sold 3 months prior, along with the silver, the dining room portraits, and her mother's piano. The driver did not help her with her trunk. She did not ask him to. Arabella Davenport had learned, in the months since her father's death, that asking for things only made the absence of them more pronounced. So she stepped down from the carriage herself, steadied her footing on the wet stone drive, and looked up at the house that would, by contract signed the previous Thursday, become her legal address within 48 hours. Thornfield Hollow, Connecticut. The house was enormous in the way that old money is enormous, not flashy, not decorated to impress, just large, built from dark stone, 3 stories, flanked by iron gates that had not been decorative since 1887. There were no flowers along the front walk, no lanterns left burning in welcome. The windows were clean and cold and told you nothing. A housekeeper named Mrs. Pelham opened the door before Arabella could knock. She was a woman of 60, with the posture of someone who had been corrected many times and had decided to simply stay corrected. Miss Davenport, not a question, not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. Yes, Arabella stepped inside. The entrance hall smelled of cedar and ink, and something faintly metallic she could not name. The floors were dark walnut. The walls were hung not with portraits but with framed survey maps, rail lines, property boundaries, geographic measurements, the kind of art a man puts on his walls when he wants you to understand immediately what he cares about. "Mr. Vanderbilt will receive you in the study at 3 o'clock, Mrs. Pelham said, taking Arabella's coat. "Luncheon is served at 12:30. The east wing is not in use and is to remain closed. Of course. Your rooms are on the 2nd floor. Dorothy will show you." Arabella followed the young maid up the staircase, her trunk dragged behind them with effort neither woman acknowledged. Her room was adequate, clean, furnished with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested it had been prepared not for a person, but for a function. The function of housing a wife before the wedding made her permanent. She set her small travel bag on the chair by the window and looked out at the grey garden below. She thought about the ledger. The ledger had been her father's. Edmund Davenport had been, by all accounts, a respectable man. A Davenport of the Hartford Davenports. Old name, old money, or money that had once been old and had since grown thin and fragile as old paper. He had invested poorly, borrowed confidently, and died in the spring of 1891, leaving behind a house mortgaged to its foundation, a widow with failing health, and one daughter who had been educated carefully in languages, music, and watercolor, none of which paid debts. What he had also left behind, tucked inside the false bottom of his mahogany desk drawer, was a leather ledger. Arabella had found it the night after the funeral, when she was going through his papers alone, because her mother could not bear the room. She had opened it expecting accounts. What she found instead was something else entirely. She had not shown it to anyone, not to the family solicitor, not to the bank, not to Mr. Aldous Fitch, the Vanderbilt attorney who had arrived at the Davenport house in September with a proposal that was, in all practical senses, not a proposal at all. Fitch had been polite in the way that powerful men's emissaries are always polite, with the calm, unbothered courtesy of someone who already knows how the conversation ends. He had explained that the Davenport property in southern Connecticut, specifically the 400 acres bordering the Vanderbilt rail corridor, was of significant interest to Mr. Reginald Vanderbilt. He had explained that the debt attached to said property had been quietly purchased by Vanderbilt Holdings the previous month. He had explained, with the same unhurried tone, that there were 2 paths forward. The first was foreclosure, swift, legal, complete. The second was a contract of marriage between Miss Arabella Davenport and Mr. Reginald Vanderbilt, a union that would resolve the debt, transfer the land, and provide Miss Davenport and her mother with a settlement sufficient for a modest, comfortable life in Hartford. "Mr. Vanderbilt is not seeking a romantic arrangement," Fitch had clarified, folding his hands. "He is seeking a legal one. You would manage his household, attend the necessary social functions, maintain the appearance appropriate to his position. In return, your debts are cleared, your mother is provided for, and you receive a quarterly allowance of your own." Arabella had sat very still for a long moment. "And if I decline?" Fitch had smiled gently, as if she had said something charming and slightly naive. The foreclosure proceeds. You and your mother have 60 days. She had signed the contract the following Thursday. She had not told Fitch about the ledger. At 3 o'clock precisely, Mrs. Pelham came to her door. Arabella had changed into a dark grey dress. Simple, well-made, one of 3 she still owned that could pass in company. She had dressed her hair herself. She wore no jewellery. The Davenport jewellery had gone with the silver. She followed Mrs. Pelham down the staircase and through a long corridor lined with more maps, more surveys, framed newspaper clippings about the Southern New England rail expansion of 1889. The door to the study was heavy oak, slightly ajar. Mrs. Pelham knocked once. "Send her in." The voice was low, not unkind, simply efficient. She went in. Reginald Vanderbilt was standing behind his desk, not sitting, which meant he had not arranged himself for comfort, but for command. He was reading something as she entered and finished reading it before he looked up. When he did look up, he regarded her with the kind of measured attention that appraises without warmth. He was evaluating whether she would be a problem. She held his gaze and let him evaluate. "Miss Davenport." He gestured to the chair across the desk. "Sit." She sat. He remained standing. "You've reviewed the contract." "I have. And you understand the terms?" "I do." "There are no terms beyond what was outlined." He said this not as reassurance, but as clarification, the way you tell a new employee that their role does not extend beyond what is written. "You'll manage the household, accompany me to required social events and maintain conduct appropriate to my name. I don't require conversation. I don't require companionship. I require a household that runs correctly and a wife who does not create difficulties." Arabella looked at him evenly. "I have no intention of creating difficulties, Mr. Vanderbilt." Something in his face shifted, too small to name, too brief to be certain of. A slight recalibration, perhaps, at a tone that was neither submissive nor combative, simply level. "Good." He sat, pulled a file toward him. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. Hartford, private ceremony, no more than 30 guests. Fitch will coordinate. You'll need to provide a list of any family members to be included." "My mother," Arabella said. "That is the complete list." A pause. He did not comment on this. "Fine." He returned his attention to the file, which was a dismissal. Arabella stood, smoothed her dress, and walked to the door. "Miss Davenport." She stopped. When she turned, his eyes were still on the papers. "The East Wing," he said. "Mrs. Pelham mentioned it was addressed. She said it was closed." "It is closed." A beat. "I mention it because people generally want to know why things are closed. The East Wing contains my late wife's rooms. They are to remain as they are. If this is a source of curiosity or distress to you, I'd prefer to know that now." Arabella considered this for a moment. A late wife that Fitch had omitted from every conversation. Rooms left unchanged. It said something. She didn't know yet what it said. "It is neither," she answered. "I am not a curious woman, Mr. Vanderbilt." He looked up then, directly, for just a moment. "Good," he said again, and looked back down. That evening, Arabella sat alone at the long dining table, while Reginald worked through dinner reviewing documents, speaking only twice, once to redirect a dish, once to inform Mrs. Pelham about a morning meeting with the county surveyor. He did not speak to Arabella. She did not require him to. She ate quietly, observed the room, and catalogued what she saw the way a woman learns to catalogue things when she understands that information is the only currency she has left. The house ran on precision. Every servant moved with rehearsed efficiency. Every lamp was lit at the same angle. The clock in the corner had not been allowed to fall a single minute behind. This was not a home. It was a system, and she had just become one of its components. After dinner, she returned to her room, closed the door, and opened the small leather case she had kept with her throughout the journey, not in the trunk, but in her travel bag, pressed against her side like a second spine. Inside was the ledger. She did not open it that night. She only set it on the desk by the window and looked at it in the lamplight for a long while. Her father had been involved with the Vanderbilt rail interests long before his death. She had gathered that much from the ledger's first pages. What she had gathered from the rest, from the columns of figures, the initials, the dates running from 1886 to 1890, was something considerably more serious. Something that, if understood correctly, meant that Reginald Vanderbilt had not simply purchased the Davenport land because it was useful. He had purchased it because he needed it buried. She closed the case, sat back, listened to the rain against the window of a house that did not belong to her, and a life she had not chosen. Then she made herself a quiet, private promise. She would not be a component in anyone's system, not even his. The contract had been signed. The terms had been set. But in the drawer of a desk in a hired room, a leather ledger held the kind of truth that no contract in the world could contain, and Arabella Davenport had not yet decided what to do with it. The wedding took place on a Tuesday. There was no music. There was no procession. There were 26 guests seated in the front parlor of a Hartford attorney's private residence, because Reginald Vanderbilt had decided, with characteristic efficiency, that a church implied sentiment, and sentiment implied an audience he was not prepared to manage. Arabella wore ivory, not white. Ivory because white was for girls who believed the ceremony meant something, and she had decided somewhere between signing the contract and boarding the carriage that morning that she would not pretend to be something she was not. Not for this. Not for him. Her mother sat in the front row and wept quietly into a handkerchief, which Arabella did not allow herself to watch, because if she watched, she would feel it, and if she felt it, she might not finish the words she was required to say. She finished the words. Reginald Vanderbilt said his portion of the ceremony without hesitation and without expression. His hands were folded in front of him. His posture was exact. He looked at the officiant when the officiant spoke, and he looked at Arabella when the occasion demanded it. Briefly, the way you look at a document you've already read and signed and have now set aside for filing. When it was done, he offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out together into the grey November afternoon, and neither of them spoke until they were inside the carriage. And even then, what Reginald said was not a word meant for her, but an instruction to the driver about the route back to Thornfield Hollow. Arabella looked out the window and watched Hartford disappear behind them. Her mother would be settled in a small house on Elm Street by the end of the week. The arrangement had been confirmed by Fitch, the allowance deposited, the details handled with the same clean efficiency that governed everything Reginald Vanderbilt touched. Her mother was safe. That was the whole of what mattered, and Arabella had repeated this to herself so many times in the past 2 weeks that it had ceased to feel like comfort and begun to feel like arithmetic. The math was correct. The sum was survivable. She kept her hands folded in her lap and did not speak for the duration of the ride. The days that followed settled into a pattern with remarkable speed, because Vanderbilt House did not accommodate disruption. It absorbed newcomers and assigned them their function before they had time to resist. Arabella's function as Mrs. Vanderbilt was precise and clearly bounded. She reviewed the household accounts each Monday morning with Mrs. Pelham. She approved menus, managed staff schedules, and received the occasional correspondence from social acquaintances of Reginald's, who sent calling cards and invitations that required polite and correctly worded replies. She attended 2 dinners in her first month, one at the home of a railroad attorney named Hargrove, one at the county commissioner's residence, seated beside her husband, speaking when spoken to, responding with the kind of measured grace that gave people the impression of warmth without actually offering any. She was good at it. She had always been good at managing appearances. It was one of the few skills her education had given her that turned out to be genuinely useful. Reginald, for his part, was exactly as he had described himself on the day they met. He did not require conversation. He did not require companionship. He arrived at the dining table at the same time each morning and each evening, ate with the focused brevity of a man who considered meals an interruption, and departed for his study or the rail offices in town without ceremony. On some evenings he did not come to dinner at all, and a tray would be sent to the study, and the dining room would be Arabella's alone, a long table, 2 candles, and the particular silence of a house that has been built to contain a man rather than a family. She did not mind the silence. She had grown up in a house where the silence meant debt and worry and things not said between her parents. This silence was different, cleaner somehow, less afraid of itself. What she minded, though she would not have admitted it to anyone, was the way the house seemed to watch her. Not the staff. They were professional and measured, neither cold nor warm, simply present and efficient in the Vanderbilt manner. Not the rooms, which were handsome in their severity. What watched her was the east wing. She passed its closed door every morning on her way to the main staircase. The door was always shut, always identical. Dark oak, brass handle, not a sound from the other side, and yet it occupied a specific kind of space in her awareness, not because she was curious, as she had told Reginald she was not, but because a door that is kept that carefully closed is never just a door. It is an instruction. It was in the 4th week that the first small thing happened. She had been in the library, Her favorite room in the house, the only one that felt as though it had been lived in rather than administered. Working through a correspondence she'd received from a Hartford Women's Charitable Society that apparently expected Mrs. Reginald Vanderbilt to chair their winter fundraising committee. She was composing a polite letter of acceptance because it was the correct thing to do, and because the charitable society would be useful, as social connections were always useful when you were new and had no allies. She hadn't heard him come in. Reginald moved quietly for a man of his size and authority, which she had noticed before but not commented on. She looked up and found him standing at the far bookshelf, pulling a volume from the third shelf. A technical manual on rail gradient engineering, which she had already catalogued in her mind as the sort of thing he would own. He glanced at her. A brief, neutral assessment. "I didn't know you used this room," he said. "Not an accusation. Simply an observation, the way you note that a piece of furniture has been moved." "I hope it's not an inconvenience," she replied, setting down her pen. "It's a library." He pulled the manual from the shelf. "It's meant to be used." He did not leave immediately, which was unusual. He stood for a moment, the book in his hand, and his eyes moved to the letter on her desk, not reading it, not close enough for that, but registering it. "The Charitable Society," he said. "Yes, the Winter Committee. I've accepted." Something moved across his face, very small, the nearest thing she had seen in 4 weeks to approval. "That's appropriate." "I thought so." He nodded once and turned to leave. "Mr. Vanderbilt." He stopped. She was not certain, even as the words left her mouth, why she said it. It was an impulse, and she was not generally a woman who acted on impulse. But something about the moment, the library, the rain again against the windows, the first exchange in weeks that had lasted more than 3 sentences, made her continue. "There are several volumes on your third shelf that have been shelved out of order. It's been bothering me. I'd like to correct them if you have no objection." A pause. He looked at her. Then, with no change in expression whatsoever, he said, "Do as you like," and left. It was, by any reasonable measure, nothing. A sentence about books. A minor domestic exchange between 2 people who shared a house and nothing else. And yet Arabella sat for a long while after he left, her pen still resting beside her unfinished letter, and found that she was thinking about the particular quality of that pause, the way he had looked at her before answering. Not as if the question itself was important, but as if the person asking it had surprised him in some way he hadn't prepared for. She picked up her pen and finished the letter. She told herself it meant nothing. That evening, for the first time, Reginald arrived at the dinner table and did not immediately open the folder of documents he typically reviewed through the meal. He sat. Mrs. Pelham brought the soup. He lifted his spoon. Arabella ate quietly across from him, the way she always did, the candles between them doing the work of making the silence seem intentional rather than empty. "The Hargrove dinner is next Friday," he said, without preamble. "I know. I received the confirmation. There will be a man there named Caldwell, Gerald Caldwell. He represents the Western expansion investors." A pause. "He asks questions." "What kind of questions?" Reginald looked up from his soup, the kind meant to look like conversation. Arabella held his gaze. "I understand. He'll speak to you. They generally assume—" He stopped, reconsidered his phrasing, which she noticed, because it was the first time she had seen him do it. "Men like Caldwell generally assume that a wife is a more accessible point of entry than a business partner. They assume," Arabella said quietly, "that a wife is decorative and therefore inattentive." Another pause. Longer this time. "Yes," he said, "and you'd like me to be attentive." "I'd like you to be exactly as you appear," he said, and to tell me afterward what he asked. She looked at him across the candlelight. He was not asking her to perform ignorance. He was asking her to perform it with full awareness, to be exactly smart enough to gather what he needed, while appearing to be exactly unassuming enough that Caldwell would not guard himself. He was, in his own calculated way, asking her to be useful. "All right," she said. He nodded and returned to his soup, but before he reached for the documents beside his plate, he paused. His hand rested on the table for a moment, not quite reaching for the folder, not quite retreating. Then he said, without looking up, "The third shelf in the library." Arabella waited. "The Thoreau belongs on the second." She blinked. He had not only noticed, he had known. "I'll remember that," she said. Reginald Vanderbilt picked up his documents and did not say another word for the rest of the evening. But something had shifted, imperceptibly, quietly, in the way that the first degree of spring shifts the air before anyone thinks to look for it. Arabella felt it and said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. That night, alone in her room, she opened the ledger. She had been careful not to look at it too often, not because she was afraid of it, but because she needed to be certain, absolutely certain, before she decided what it meant and what she intended to do with it. She spread it open on the desk and went through the entries she had marked in pencil on a separate sheet of paper, cross-referencing dates against the rail expansion timeline she had quietly memorized from the framed clippings in the corridor. The numbers aligned in a way that left no room for ambiguity. Her father had not simply been a poor investor and a man of declining fortunes. He had been a witness, possibly an unwilling one, to a financial arrangement that involved the early Vanderbilt rail contracts, a misrepresentation of land survey results, and payments made through 3 separate intermediaries to county officials who had approved the Southern Corridor expansion in 1888. Payments that, if traced correctly, led back to Vanderbilt Holdings. Payments that her father had recorded meticulously in a leather ledger that no one knew existed. Arabella closed the book, pressed her hands flat against the cover. She thought about the man across the hall who had told her not to be curious and who had noticed which shelf the Thoreau belonged on, and who had asked her tonight to be useful. She thought about what he would do if he knew what she was holding. She thought about what she would do if he found out before she was ready. The ledger went back into the leather case. The case went back beneath the floorboard she had quietly loosened on her second day in the house, when she had understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had nothing left to lose but information, that the only thing worth protecting was the truth, and that the truth in a house like this one needed somewhere safe to sleep. She had come to Vanderbilt House as a transaction, but transactions, she was beginning to understand, have a way of becoming something far more complicated, especially when one party is holding a ledger that the other party has spent 3 years trying to erase. The Hargrove dinner was the kind of evening that looked like pleasure and functioned like business. 12 guests, 3 courses, 2 kinds of wine, and a drawing room afterward, where the men separated from the women with the practiced ease of people who had been doing it so long they no longer noticed it was a choice. The Hargrove house was large and well-appointed, in the manner of new money attempting the vocabulary of old. Too many paintings, too much gilding on the ceiling trim, flowers arranged with the kind of excess that signals effort rather than abundance. Arabella noticed all of it, and gave none of it her attention. She was watching Gerald Caldwell. He had arrived late, which she suspected was intentional, the entrance of a man who understood that a room's attention is easiest to capture after the room has already settled. He was somewhere past 50, with silver hair worn slightly long for fashion and a smile that functioned like a handshake, firm, practiced, briefly warm, and entirely professional. He wore his confidence the way certain men wear expensive watches, not to tell the time, to tell you something about themselves. He had greeted Reginald at the door with the familiarity of men who have done business long enough to simulate friendship, and then he had looked across the room at Arabella with the particular species of attention she had been warned about, the kind that calculates while appearing to admire. "Mrs. Vanderbilt," he had said, taking her hand. "I've been curious to meet you. Reginald kept you rather private this season." "We're recently married," she said pleasantly. "I've been settling in." "Of course." His smile held a moment longer than it needed to. "Thornfield Hollow is quite the estate. I imagine it takes some adjustment." "Any home does," she said. "I find I'm managing." She had smiled and moved away before he could continue, because the first rule of a conversation like that one is never to let the other person set the rhythm. Dinner was arranged with Arabella seated between Hargrove's brother-in-law, a cheerful and largely harmless man who manufactured wool in Providence, and a county judge whose primary interest was in describing at considerable length a fishing excursion he had taken the previous September. She listened to both of them with the attentiveness of a woman who had been raised to make men feel interesting, laughed at the appropriate moments, and kept Gerald Caldwell in her peripheral vision throughout every course. He was seated 4 places to her left, beside a woman in green silk who was clearly the wife of someone important, and equally clearly bored by the fact. Caldwell spoke to the table more than he spoke to her, the habit of a man who preferred audiences to conversations. He talked about the Western expansion, about the investment climate, about the opportunities he saw in the consolidation of the smaller rail lines in Ohio and Pennsylvania. He talked notably about the importance of clean land acquisition records. Arabella cut her lamb and said nothing, but she heard it. But she, in the drawing room afterward, while the men remained with their port and the women arranged themselves around the fireplace in a way that suggested relaxation while actually constituting a social hierarchy. Arabella accepted a cup of tea and positioned herself near the window. She had been there perhaps 8 minutes when Caldwell appeared in the doorway, which meant he had not stayed with the men, which meant the port and the political conversation were not what he had come for tonight. He crossed the room with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who is used to arriving wherever he has decided to arrive, accepted a cup from the tray, and settled beside her with the ease of someone claiming a space he had already reserved in his mind. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, which meant he did not consider it an intrusion at all. "I find these divided evenings rather old-fashioned, don't you?" "I find them useful," Arabella said. "It gives the women time to talk without being managed," he laughed. Genuinely, she thought, or close enough to genuine that it didn't matter. "Reginald said you were direct. I wasn't sure whether to believe him." She looked at him with mild interest. "He spoke of me?" "Only in the most general terms. He's not a man who discusses his personal life. You'll know that better than I do." A pause, measured, designed to feel casual. "How are you finding Thornfield Hollow? The house, the county? It's quite removed from Hartford society." "I prefer it," she said honestly. "Hartford society is rather loud." Another laugh. Smaller this time. He was recalibrating. She could feel it. The way you recalibrate when someone fails to respond to the script you've prepared. She was not performing loneliness or displacement, or any of the things he had presumably expected a new and socially isolated wife to perform. "Your father was Edmund Davenport," he said, not a question. "Yes, I knew him. Slightly. He was involved in some of the early survey work on the southern corridor. Before the expansion, he let this sit in the air between them for a moment, the way you let a fishing line sit. Relaxed, patient, waiting to see if anything rises to it." Arabella looked at him pleasantly and let the moment pass without touching it. "He had many business associations," she said. "I was not greatly involved in his professional life. I'm afraid I can't tell you much about that period." "Of course not." His smile did not change. "I only mention it because it's a small world, the rail business. Connections are long. Memories are longer." "Indeed," she agreed. "More tea, Mr. Caldwell?" He declined. He excused himself shortly after, and Arabella watched him make his way back toward the corridor with the unhurried ease of a man who had not gotten what he came for but was not yet concerned about it. She set down her cup very carefully. Her hands were steady. Inside, she was not entirely steady, but that was a private matter. The carriage ride home from the Hargrove dinner lasted 40 minutes. For the first 20, nothing was said. Reginald sat across from her in the dark interior, one arm resting along the window frame, his gaze directed outward at the passing Connecticut countryside. He had removed his gloves. She noticed this because it was the first time she had seen him in any state of undress, however minor, in proximity to another person. At the 20-minute mark, without turning from the window, he said, "Caldwell spoke to you, in the drawing room. Approximately 12 minutes. What did he ask?" Arabella folded her hands in her lap. "He asked how I was finding Thornfield Hollow. He mentioned my father, the early survey work on the southern corridor. He let the mention sit and waited to see if I would respond to it." A beat. Reginald turned from the window. In the dark of the carriage, with only the passing lamplight from the road intermittently crossing his face, she could not read his expression the way she had learned to read it across a dinner table, but she felt the quality of his attention shift. "Did you respond to it?" "I told him I was not involved in my father's professional life and could tell him very little about that period." Another beat. Longer. "And was that true?" The question arrived quietly, without aggression, but it was not a casual question, and they both understood that. Arabella looked at him across the dark interior of the carriage, at the man who had bought her family's debt and offered a contract in place of choices, at the man who corrected the placement of Thoreau on his shelves and asked her to be usefully unassuming at other people's dinner tables, at the man whose late wife's rooms remained closed and unchanged at the end of the East Wing. "It was accurate," she said carefully. "I was not involved in his professional life." Reginald held her gaze for a moment. The lamplight passed across his face once and was gone. "Caldwell doesn't ask questions without purpose," he said. "He's representing a group of investors who believe there are irregularities in the original Southern Corridor land records. They've been building a case for 2 years. Arabella kept her breathing even. "What kind of irregularities?" "Survey misrepresentations, approval payments, the kind of thing that, if documented and presented correctly, could challenge the validity of the corridor acquisition and expose the early partners. He paused. Including your father. She said nothing. Edmund Davenport is dead, Reginald continued. His estate is resolved. There is nothing for Caldwell to extract from a dead man, but there may be things he believes the dead man left behind. The carriage moved through the dark. Is that why you purchased the land? She asked. Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. And the debt? He looked at her for a long moment. I purchased the land because it completes the corridor, he said, and the debt because debt creates options. It was not a denial. It was not a confession. It was the answer of a man who had learned to speak in ways that remained technically true while revealing as little as possible. Arabella understood this because she had been doing the same thing for the past 4 weeks. If there were documents, she said, choosing each word as you choose footing on uncertain ground, that implicated the early partners, my father among them, what would you do with them? The question hung in the carriage like smoke. Reginald was very still. I would protect what could be protected, he said finally, and contain what could not. And the person who held them? He looked at her, directly, with an attention that was nothing like his usual assessment, nothing like the evaluating gaze of a man calculating utility. This was something older and more careful and considerably more dangerous. That would depend, he said, on what they intended to do with them. The carriage turned through the gates of Thornfield Hollow. The house rose before them in the dark, stone and lamplight. East wing shuttered and silent. Arabella looked at it and thought about the leather case beneath the loosened floorboard and the ledger inside it, and the 12 weeks she had spent deciding whether Reginald Vanderbilt was a man who deserved the truth or a man who needed to be outmaneuvered by it. She was running out of time to decide. That night, she did not go to her room directly. She stood in the corridor outside the east wing and looked at the closed door for a long time, not because she intended to open it, but because something Caldwell had said was turning slowly in the back of her mind. His mention of the survey work, the careful way he had watched for her reaction, the particular phrase he had used. Memories are longer. She pressed her palm flat against the east wing door. The wood was cold. Behind it, a room preserved exactly as it had been left. A life interrupted and kept in suspension by a man who was precise about everything, who ordered his bookshelves and his dinner table and his professional associates with exact and deliberate control. A man who had not, in all this time, explained how his wife had died. She removed her hand from the door. She went to her room. She sat at the desk. She opened the ledger to the page she had marked and looked at the entry dated March of 1889, a payment record, an initial she had not yet been able to attribute to a specific individual, a property description that matched the eastern boundary of the Vanderbilt corridor to within 40 feet. She picked up her pen. She wrote a single name on the separate sheet of paper. Then she sat back and looked at it and understood, with the slow and terrible clarity of a woman who has just placed the last piece of something she did not entirely want to complete, exactly how far the damage went and exactly why Gerald Caldwell was not the most dangerous person in the room. She had entered this house as a contract. She had remained in it as a function. But the woman sitting at that desk in the lamplight, with a ledger open before her and a name written on a page, that woman was neither, and the empire around her was about to find out the difference. The letter arrived on a Monday morning. It was addressed to Reginald, but it had been opened before reaching his desk. Not by him, which meant someone in the house had intercepted it, or someone outside the house had arranged for it to arrive already compromised. Arabella knew this because Mrs. Pelham brought it to her first, pale-faced and unusually still, with the envelope held between 2 fingers as though it was something that could burn. This came for Mr. Vanderbilt, Mrs. Pelham said. I thought you should see it before he does. Arabella took it without comment. The letter was from Aldous Fitch, not the version of Fitch who had sat across from her in Hartford with folded hands and polished manners. This was a different Fitch, hurried, stripped of ceremony. 3 short paragraphs that said in the language of a man trying to warn without incriminating himself that Gerald Caldwell had filed a formal petition with the Connecticut Land Authority, that the petition cited irregularities in the Southern Corridor acquisition dating to 1888, that the filing referenced specifically the existence of private financial records held by Edmund Davenport at the time of his death. Caldwell knew the ledger existed. He did not know where it was, but he had 48 hours before the petition required a formal response from Vanderbilt Holdings, and a response without documentation would be taken by the authority as a concession. Arabella folded the letter, set it on the desk, sat very still for the space of perhaps 30 seconds. Then she went to the loosened floorboard beneath the window seat, retrieved the leather case, and carried it downstairs to Reginald's study. He was already there. He had his own copy of the communication. A telegraph, she realized, which had arrived earlier than the letter, and which he had been reading when she came through the door. He looked up when she entered, and his face was doing the thing it did when the situation exceeded the boundaries of his usual control, a tightening around the jaw, a particular stillness in the eyes that was not calm, but was the performance of calm. She set the leather case on his desk. He looked at it, then at her. "What is that?" "My father's ledger," she said. "He kept records of the survey payments, the intermediaries, the county approvals, every transaction from 1886 to 1890, recorded in his hand, with dates and figures and the initials of every party involved." The silence in the room was absolute. "You've had this since before the contract," he said. It was not a question. Since the night after his funeral, he stood slowly, not with anger, with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who is choosing in real time how to respond to something that has removed every assumption he was operating under. He looked at the case on his desk and did not touch it. "You came into this house knowing what it contained?" "Yes, and you said nothing." "I needed to understand what I was dealing with," she said. "I needed to understand what you were dealing with, and I needed to understand whether you were the kind of man who would destroy it or the kind who would use it correctly." He looked at her then, directly, fully, with none of the managed distance he kept between himself and everything that mattered to him. "And which did you decide?" Arabella held his gaze without flinching. "I decided you were the kind of man who has been protecting something for a long time and has run out of ways to do it alone." The clock on the shelf marked the silence between them, with small, indifferent strokes. "Open it," she said. He did. He went through the ledger with the focused attention of a man reading a document that determines the remainder of his life, which was precisely what it was. She watched him move through the pages, the survey entries, the payment columns, the initials she had spent weeks cross-referencing. She watched the moment he reached page 31, where the initial she had been unable to attribute was recorded beside a payment of $4,000, disbursed through a Providence account in February of 1889. His hand stopped. "You know whose initial that is," she said quietly. He did not answer immediately. He closed the ledger with the measured care of a man who has just confirmed something he had spent years trying not to confirm. "Hargrove," he said. "Not Gerald Caldwell, not Vanderbilt Holdings, Hargrove, the man in whose dining room they had sat 10 days ago, with his gilded ceiling and his excessive flowers and his cheerful performance of established wealth, the man who had been Reginald's closest social ally in Thornfield Hollow for 11 years, the man whose brother-in-law manufactured wool in Providence, through a Providence account. He was the intermediary," Arabella said, "not a passive one. He arranged the payments, he controlled the approvals, and he used my father as the record keeper, because my father was respectable enough to give the arrangement credibility and dependent enough not to refuse." She paused. "Caldwell isn't building a case against you, Mr. Vanderbilt. He's building a case against Hargrove. And Hargrove has spent 2 years making certain that every trail leads back to Vanderbilt Holdings before it leads to him." Reginald sat down. It was the first time she had seen him sit in a way that was not a choice, but a necessity. He looked at the ledger on his desk, at the handwriting of a dead man who had recorded the truth with the meticulous guilt of someone who knew they were complicit and could not find a way to be otherwise, at the evidence that cleared one name and destroyed another, and had been sitting beneath a floorboard in his own house for 4 months. "Why?" he said, and his voice was different now, lower, stripped of its professional register, something beneath it that she had not heard before. "Why bring it to me now? You could have taken it to Caldwell, cleared your father's name publicly, removed yourself from this house and this contract entirely." Arabella looked at him steadily. "Because clearing my father's name through a public petition would have required implicating Vanderbilt Holdings regardless of who was actually responsible. It would have destroyed what you built, and you didn't build it dishonestly." She paused. "Hargrove used your name the same way he used my father. The difference is, you have the power to answer it. My father didn't." The clock continued its indifferent counting. "The ledger goes to your attorney today," she said. "Not Fitch. Fitch is too close to the existing arrangement, someone outside the county. It is presented to the land authority before Caldwell's petition deadline as evidence that the irregularities originated with Hargrove and were concealed through misdirection. Your holdings are separated cleanly from the approval payments. My father's records exonerate him." She folded her hands. "Hargrove faces the petition." Not you. Reginald was quiet for a long moment. And what do you want for this? He said. Nothing beyond what the contract already provides. He looked at her. That's not an answer, that's a deflection. She almost smiled. I want my mother's allowance guaranteed independently of this marriage, written separately, irrevocable, regardless of what happens to the contract afterward. I want my father's name recorded correctly in whatever documentation comes from this proceeding. And I want the East Wing unlocked. The last one surprised him. She could see it. The East Wing, he said. A house with a sealed room is a house still deciding whether to live in the present, she said quietly. I think it's time. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessing look, not the managed distance. Something that had no professional category. Something that had been building, she understood now, since a conversation about bookshelves in a library on a rainy afternoon. You could have left, he said. With the ledger, you had every means to leave. Yes, she said. But you stayed. I stayed. He did not ask why. Perhaps because he already knew. Perhaps because some things, said plainly, lose the precise quality that makes them true. He picked up the ledger. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at her, with the expression of a man setting down something heavy he had been carrying for a very long time. I'll have Mrs. Pelham unlock the East Wing this afternoon, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic pronouncement. It was a man making a decision about a door, which, in a house like that one, in a life like theirs, was the only kind of beginning that would ever mean anything. Arabella nodded once. She walked to the door of the study. Stopped. Mr. Vanderbilt. Reginald, he said quietly, without looking up from the ledger. She paused at that, just for a moment. Then she walked out into the corridor, past the framed survey maps and the rail expansion clippings, toward the East Wing and its long-closed door, and behind her, in the study, the sound of a man reaching for his pen, not to sign a contract, not to manage a holding, but to begin at last telling the truth. The empire did not fall that day, but it was never again built on silence.